It's the Ross Kaminsky Show.
You're a great American.
Now, Ross Kaminsky.
Come on, man.
On Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
All right, good morning. Don't you love it when the first work day of the week is Tuesday? Even though I don't like Tuesdays very much, when it happens this way, it's all right. I love 3-day weekends, and I still think, I say this every time we have a 3-day weekend, every single time. I think the evolution of work in America is going to be towards a 4-day work week and 3-day weekends pretty commonly, but I don't think it'll ever apply to a talk radio host. So I think my only 3-day weekends are going to be whenever the federal holidays are, but that's okay. That's okay. We should all enjoy them while we can. Whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, allow me to wish you a very, very happy New Year. Rosh Hashanah started last night, and yeah, Jewish New Year. Jewish New Year. The Jewish New Year actually, theoretically, in the Jewish calendar is supposed to represent the anniversary of creation, not just of a year, like the year that we celebrate now on January 1st. So that's a big deal, I suppose. If the world hadn't been created, then we probably wouldn't be here talking about it. Just how that works. So I hope you're having a wonderful New Year so far. And it doesn't exactly feel like a New Year, but what are you going to do? We've got a lot going on today on the show, and a lot of different sort of stuff. I think the highlight for me is that an hour from now, we're going to have Joel Rosenberg back on the show from Israel. And he's got a new book out. It's called Enemies and Allies. And, the last, 4 times we've had Joel on the show, 5, whatever. It's been for one of his thriller novels. This is his first nonfiction book in a very long time. And it's very interesting. It is essentially about his getting to know and meeting with, and then bringing a group of evangelical leaders to meet with key leaders in the Middle East. General al-Sisi, who runs Egypt, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates, MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who's been quite a controversial figure with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and of course, people in Israel, and presidents and vice presidents and secretaries of state here in America. So he's written a whole book about meeting these people and about talking to them about how to create peace in the Middle East and threats facing the Middle East. For example, the alliance between Russia and Turkey. We're going to talk about all of that with Joel coming up an hour from now. So I'm very excited about that. We got other stuff that we're going to do too, and I'll tell you about that later. Let me just start with something that I was, I don't have on my so-called show sheet. I prepare this document before each show and use it as a very rough guide that I tend to follow at least 10 or 15%. But I use it as my guide for what I'm going to be doing on the show. But every once in a while, stuff comes up at the last minute that I hadn't written down, and I feel like it's important to talk about. So this morning, you know how I like to flip around between the various cable news stations just to try to get a sense of what everybody's talking about, because I can predict pretty well what Fox will be talking about, and most of my friends and a lot of stuff I read tends to have that kind of bias, and I like to make sure that I take in all the points of view so I know how everybody's thinking. And so I had Morning Joe on MSNBC on this morning, and of course MSNBC is, if it's not the most liberal network, it's certainly the most liberal network that people have heard of. And I don't know if there is a more liberal network than MSNBC. Is there a tiny left-wing version of OAN, like the fringy far-right Trumpy thing on cable? I don't know if there's a left-wing version of that. So as far as I know, MSNBC is the most leftist thing. And what they were talking about this morning was remarkable. It was about the harm being caused by cancel culture and the harm being caused by silencing. And a lot of it was, I'm sure unintentionally from their point of view, but a lot of it was along the lines of the kind of stuff that we talked with Ben Shapiro about last week. And you remember with Ben, we talked about this fantastic concept called renormalization. And just to learn about and understand that concept is worth the price of Ben's book, which is called The Authoritarian Moment. And he talked, I'll give you the example he gave, the metaphor that he gave, in case you weren't listening. He said, imagine, you got a family of 4, and the teenage daughter comes home one day and says, I've decided to become vegetarian. I think he said vegan on the show. I think it's vegetarian in the book. But either way. All right, so I've decided to become vegan. And nobody else in the family is vegan. And nobody really wants to be vegan because what normal human being with, incisor teeth and canines believes that our job is to just eat fruits and vegetables and not even eat honey. But anyway, so now the mom is in a quandary in this family. Should I just make a vegan meal for the kid and a different meal for everybody else, but then I'm cooking 2 meals? Should I just make a vegan meal for everybody? Because that's easiest, and, then the vegan will be happy and the other people will be, only slightly unhappy, but they can handle it. Or should I only make one meal that's not vegan, in which case, I risk having that one kid be really miserable or even maybe not eating and getting malnutrition and all that. And Ben's point was most of the time people make choice B in that situation, right? They make that loud complaining, how the squeaky wheel gets the grease, like that kind of thing. So they do the vegan thing and they just make everybody eat it. And now suddenly you've got a whole family eating vegan food, even though 3/4 of them don't want to. And then, he expanded it. Now you go to a neighborhood block party, and now you got the same thing. There's now you've got a vegan person or a vegan family, and now the whole block has to eat vegan, or else they have to cook multiple meals for people. And you end up where just one person with one bad idea ends up turning a bunch of people into, if not devout followers, at least going along with that bad idea. And cancel culture very much falls into this. And I asked Ben near the end of our interview, what do we do about it? And he said, it's simple, just refuse to go along. And when they tell you you've got to behave this way, or you've got to talk this way, you can only use words a certain way, just say, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not having a vegan meal. I'm not talking about social justice, which I'll mention in the Ross Report today, because it's not really social and it's definitely not justice, and I'm not going to allow you to make me use words in ways that they don't actually mean in order to further your political agenda. Just no, I'm not going to go along with it anymore. And it was remarkable to hear the beginnings of this kind of conversation on Morning Joe on MSNBC this morning. They had a woman on, and I didn't catch her name or her title, but she was talking about how risky all this stuff is where people are afraid to talk. Joe Scarborough, the former Republican congressman and close friend and big supporter of Donald Trump until he turned into a bitter enemy and raging opponent of Donald Trump, said that he and his wife, who is his show co-host, Mika Brzezinski, they got married at some point, had some people over this summer, and most of their friends are liberals these days. And they were talking about it. He said in every dinner time conversation, this same subject just kept coming up. And they're talking with left of center parents, maybe not radical leftists, but, moderate liberal, kind of normal, mainstream liberal sorts of parents who send their kids to the best boarding schools or the best colleges or public schools in New York City. And they were talking about how these parents that they were having dinner with are all talking about how they either are already or are seriously considering pulling their kids out of these schools because not just of the brainwashing, right? I mean, liberals like liberal stuff, but because of the utter intolerance of even a minor dissenting point of view, and they think that it's harmful for their children to live in a world where they're taught that it is okay to silence people with whom you disagree. I know, isn't that a shock? It's incredible we're even having this conversation. And then Scarborough said, some of these dinner parties they were having at their house, sometimes their guests would bring along their kids. And some of these kids are college-aged kids. And I think it was Joe Scarborough in particular who said, and I'm talking about like 25 minutes ago, right? He said, this was the scariest stuff we heard from college students saying, we don't talk anymore in class. We're afraid to talk because if we say the wrong thing, all hell is going to come down on us, and we're at risk of being canceled and having our lives ruined and having all kinds of stuff spread about us on social media. One of the people in the conversation this morning was talking about a college professor who said, and they didn't name what the example was, but he said there was some example from history that he thought was a really important thing that year after year after year after year after however many decades of teaching he's been doing, he always used this example in his class. And again, they didn't say what the example was. They didn't say whether it was American history or, European history or some other thing. They didn't say. What they said was that the teacher has decided not to use that example in class anymore because they're afraid it might offend somebody. And when you start hearing this conversation on MSNBC with their liberal guests, there's starting to be some pushback. And by the way, the most important thing is the pushback. From a societal basis, we must stop all this cancel culture. From a political perspective, though, that all this cancel culture stuff is associated with the left. It's associated with Democrats. And it's going to hurt the Democrats politically in much the same way that defund the police hurt Democrats a lot in the 2020 election and are part of the reason that Republicans did much better than expected, notwithstanding the loss of the presidential election. Republicans did better than any pollsters thought, even the most pro-Republican pollsters. Republicans did better. And a lot of it was because people look at the left as a bunch of defund the police, cancel culture lunatics. And the left, they better figure it out. The problem is they still live in this world where they're all afraid of a tweet from AOC and a tweet from Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. And they live in absolute panic of these socialist, ignorant, anti-Semitic, anti-American lunatics. And they don't have the cojones to just stand up to AOC and say, you have no idea what you're talking about. You're an ignorant 20-something-year-old who had your head filled with mush at Boston University, the place where Ibram X. Kendi, the biggest race hustler in America right now, works. He wasn't there, by the way, when AOC was there. They did not overlap. That would have been interesting if they had. But the fact that this conversation is coming up on the left is a really good thing for America. And additionally, it's a really bad thing for Democrats, in the short term at least, because the more the public wakes up to it and gets pissed off about how their kids feel like they cannot talk in class in school anymore for fear of offending somebody, they're going to blame it on Democrats. A perfect example we talked about on the show, and then Ben Shapiro brought it up. What is this guy's name? McLean, I think? McNeil? Mick something. Professor, we've talked about this story. He was on a trip with some younger students, kind of as a chaperone for this trip. And I think it was a middle school or high school student asked him, when is it okay to use the N-word? And in his answer, he used the N-word essentially to say, it's okay to say, and I can't say it on the radio because I'll get in trouble. It's okay to say that word if you are talking about it in a historical context. For example, in the Jim Crow South, racist whites might have used the word that I can't say as a representation of their disdain for black people. But it's not okay to say the word that I can't say as a generic insult for black people. In fact, it's not okay to say the word that I can't say in most circumstances these days. It can only be used legitimately, typically, in a circumstance where you were talking about its historical use. So that was what happened. And so he used the word in that context of answering that question, and he ended up getting fired from the New York Times for it. And the publisher of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, who is as big a wussy, cancel culture, politically correct loser as you can imagine, came out and said, it's never okay to use that word regardless of context. How can a newspaper, the newspaper of record, ever say that it's not okay to use any word regardless of context? Isn't context everything? Isn't there pretty much any word, with the possible exception of one or two and only one or two words from George Carlin's list of words you can't say on the radio, audio which we will not play on the radio because it would all be bleeped out? Can you not imagine a situation in which, in the right context, you could use any of those words? For example, Shannon called Ross a, quote, fill in the blank, end quote. Would that not be an appropriate context, right? Ross and his producer Shannon got into a all-out brawl, flinging milkshakes at each other because Ross called Shannon a, and then whatever the word is. Now, even if that word is a word you would never use in polite society, in that context of reporting why Ross and Shannon are throwing milkshakes at each other, wouldn't it be relevant? Doesn't the context matter? Don't you think so, Shannon? That when I called you that, scooter. Right. Can't say midget anymore either. I think you're still allowed to say scooter. I went to see Brad at Comedy Works South at the Landmark on Friday. Awesome. And then I went to see Jay Farrow at the Sunday show at Comedy Works downtown in Larimer Square. I got to tell you, I've never seen better crowd energy at any comedy show ever than that Sunday show. It was unbelievable. Jay Farrow did over an hour and a half. It was fantabulous. All right, we'll be right back. Keep it here.
KHOW Denver, 630 KHOW, an iHeartRadio station. Available everywhere on our free iHeartRadio app. #1 for music, radio, and podcasts.